No family wanted the 65-year-old spinster rejected 30 times, until a grieving widower found her letter. The letter came in a box of junk I bought at auction. I didn't even want the box. I wanted the hand plow leaning against the wall behind it, an old iron-tipped thing, good weight to it, handle worn smooth by whoever had worked it. But the auctioneer ran the two together the way they do, and I ended up with both for 60 cents, which was either a bargain or the beginning of something I wouldn't understand until much later. This was November of 1887, outside Benton, Colorado. High plains country, where the wind doesn't so much blow as lean against you, constant and personal. The auction was a dead man's sale. A homesteader named Gus Albrecht who'd run out of luck before he ran out of land, and his widow had already gone back east to her people before the body was cold. Everything sold. The tools, the furniture, the tin coffee pot with the cracked lid. Even the 2 dogs, though nobody bid on those, and they just stood there by the gate watching us all leave. I loaded the plow and the box onto my wagon and drove home. The box sat in my barn for 3 weeks. I'd go in for rope or a lantern and step around it the way you do with things you're not ready to look at. It was maybe 2 feet wide, a foot deep, full of what appeared to be old papers and a few broken harness rings and a woman's button hook with the handle split. Household debris, the kind that accumulates when people stop caring what they keep. I had no use for any of it. I kept meaning to burn it. What stopped me burning it, I couldn't have told you at the time. My name is Cal Breckett. I was 67 years old that winter, and I had been a widower for 4 years, and I was not managing it well, though I would have told you otherwise if you'd asked. My ranch covered about 200 acres north of town, good grass, a reliable creek, a solid house that Ruth and I had built the 3rd year of our marriage when the first one burned. Ruth died of a fever in November of 1883. Quick, the way they say is merciful but doesn't feel it. After she was gone, the house got quieter than a house ought to be. You get used to the sounds of another person, the particular way they set a cup down, the sound of their breathing when they read, the creak of a certain floorboard they always hit at the same place. When those sounds stop, it doesn't go quiet so much as go wrong. Like a clock running with 1 gear missing, still moving but off. I managed the ranch. I kept the cattle. I cooked enough to stay alive and not much better, beans mostly, biscuits when I felt ambitious, coffee strong enough to strip a fence post. Neighbors checked on me the first year, then less than not at all, the way it goes. I wasn't unfriendly toward them, I just didn't have much to say. My son Dix was in New Mexico. We wrote twice a year, Christmas and his birthday in March. He had a family of his own, a good wife, 3 boys I'd only met once. He'd asked me to come down. I told him I was fine. I wasn't fine, but I wasn't looking for anything either. A man my age and my situation in that place and time, you didn't go looking. You just kept moving. The work kept you from thinking too much, and that was the arrangement. The box, right. First week of December, I was looking for a particular wrench, middle of a cold snap that had frozen the windmill bearing. I was annoyed and in a hurry, and I kicked the box trying to get past it, and the side split and papers went everywhere. I swore. I stood there looking at the mess on my barn floor and thought, all right, I'll sort the damn thing and burn what's burnable and be done with it. Most of it was what I expected. Receipt stubs, a ledger with 3 pages filled in and the rest blank. Some old newspaper folded so many times it tore when I opened it. The harness rings. A daguerreotype of a couple I didn't recognize, young and serious in their wedding clothes, standing very straight. I set that one aside. Seemed wrong to burn a wedding portrait. The letter was at the bottom, in an envelope that had never been sealed, just folded shut and tucked, the way people did when they meant to send something and then didn't. The paper was good quality, cream-colored, the handwriting very neat and even, like someone had practiced it. No address on the outside. Just in small, careful letters in the upper left corner, E. Crane. I don't know why I read it. It wasn't mine. But there was no one to return it to, and I was sitting on a cold barn floor with my back against a post and the wind coming under the door, and I opened it. It started, to whoever might want a woman like me. I read it 3 times before I moved. Her name was Eleanor Crane. Ellie, she said, though she'd been called Miss Crane since she was 22 and wasn't sure she remembered what her Christian name sounded like in another person's mouth. She was 63 years old, she said, which she understood was not a selling point. She lived outside Gillette, Wyoming, on a small piece of land she'd homesteaded herself after her father died, and before that had kept her father's house for 12 years after her mother passed. which is why she was 63 and not married. There'd been a man once. She wrote that plain, no drama around it. There'd been a man once, and he hadn't waited, and she understood why, and she didn't blame him, but it had closed a door she didn't know how to reopen after. She had responded to 30 advertisements in the matrimonial papers. She wrote this without embarrassment, just as a fact. 30 over the course of 7 years. Some hadn't written back. Some had written back and then stopped. 2 had come to meet her and then found reasons not to proceed. She did not describe herself as pretty, which I respected. She said she was tall, capable, plain-spoken, not given to complaint, and that she could work as hard as most men she'd known and harder than some, which again, not a selling point for a man who wanted a soft wife, but there it was. She'd stopped writing to the papers. She wasn't writing this letter to send it anywhere. She was writing it, she said, because she was tired of feeling like a woman nobody wanted was somehow less of a woman, and she wanted to put the truth of herself down on paper at least once, for herself, even if no one ever read it. She wanted a man who was decent and not cruel. She wanted someone who'd talk to her at supper. She said she had found that most men underestimated what a thing that was to have someone to talk to at supper, until they'd gone a long time without it. She said she had things to say and had been saving them up for years with nowhere to put them. She said she was good with cattle, fair with horses, and that her biscuits were better than anything she'd ever been served in a dining establishment, which she admitted was a low bar but still. She said she did not expect love exactly. She'd gotten old enough to know that love was a thing you built more than you found, and she was willing to build if someone was willing to start. She said she was sorry to be 63. That last part got me right in the sternum. I sat in that barn until the cold had worked all the way through my coat and my hands had gone stiff. Then I went inside and built up the fire and read it again at the kitchen table under the lamp. Here is what I knew about myself by then. I was a man who had been good at his life when Ruth was in it and adequate to his life after she wasn't, and the difference between those two things had been eating at me in a way I didn't have the vocabulary for. It wasn't grief anymore, or not only grief. It was something closer to being shelved, like a tool nobody reached for, like you'd done your useful work and now you just sat. Ruth had seen me. That's the only way I can put it. She'd seen what I was capable of, and she'd told me so plainly, without fuss, and that knowledge of being seen had gone into me and run all the way through, held things together the way a good weld does. When she died, the weld cracked. Nothing fell apart, but I could feel the place where it had broken every day. I thought about Ellie Crane writing. I did not expect love exactly. And I thought, here is a woman who knows what it is to be passed over. I'm not saying I wasn't being a fool. A man finds a letter in a dead man's box and takes it for a sign. That's the kind of thing you'd roll your eyes at if someone else told it to you at a bar. I knew that. I was 67, not 17. I had practical objections to my own thinking, and I ran through all of them that night, sitting there with the fire burning down and my coffee going cold. She wrote that letter to no one. She hadn't sent it anywhere. She might be dead. She might be married by now somehow. She might be nothing like what she'd put on paper. People aren't always. All of that. And then, and what if she isn't? It took me 2 weeks to write back. Not because I was unsure, because I was sure, which felt dangerous and stupid in equal measure, and because I wanted to get it right. I wrote 4 drafts that I burned and 1 that I kept. I told her how I'd come by the letter, which I figured I owed her, and I told her my situation, plain. 200 acres, 1 man, 2 quiet, 4 years a widower, 1 son far away, no complaints about the work, considerable complaints about the evenings. I told her I was 67, which I also figured I owed her. I told her I was not a man of much poetry, but I was a man of my word, and I had been told that was worth something. I told her that her biscuits were probably better than mine, which was true of almost anyone, and that I had been saving up things to say at supper for 4 years now with nowhere to put them either. I told her I didn't expect anything. I was just writing back. I sent it to E. Crane, Gillette, Wyoming. I figured the postmaster would know her in a town that size. I didn't know what would happen, and I tried not to think about it. She wrote back in 11 days, which meant she'd written back almost immediately. Her handwriting was the same as on the original letter, that careful evenness, like someone who had been told once that her penmanship was the one thing she could control, and had taken it seriously. She wrote that she had read my letter 3 times, which I was glad to know. She wrote that she appreciated my honesty about the 4 drafts I'd burned. She said most men didn't admit to drafts. She wrote for 6 pages, both sides. I'm not going to recount all of it, because some of it was hers to say to me and not mine to say to anyone else. But I'll tell you this much. She had a brother in Kansas she hadn't spoken to in 8 years over a land dispute. She'd nursed a neighbor woman through a bad winter, alone, riding over every day in weather that would have stopped most men. She'd had a horse named Clement that she'd put down the previous spring and still hadn't replaced because she didn't want to and nobody could make her. She had strong opinions about politics that she'd never been able to say out loud because nobody had ever asked her. She said her eyesight was going some in the left eye, but her right was still good. She said she'd been told she laughed too loud, and she'd stopped worrying about it sometime around age 50. She asked me what I thought about in the evenings, sitting alone. Nobody had asked me that in 4 years. I wrote back a long letter. I told her about Ruth, not everything, not the way you'd tell a priest, but enough. I told her that I thought about the cattle some and the fence lines and the ordinary business of the ranch, but that mostly I sat there and felt the particular shape of the quiet, and that the particular shape of it was the shape of everything that wasn't there anymore. I told her that sounded maudlin, and I apologized for it. She wrote back and told me not to apologize, that knowing the shape of a loss was not the same as drowning in it, and that she respected a man who could tell the difference. We wrote through December and January. By February, I knew the names of her cattle. I knew that she took her coffee black, and that she thought most ministers' sermons were too long by half. I knew that she'd once refused a man's proposal because he'd been unkind to a horse, and she'd never told that story to anyone. In February, she said, I suppose we should decide whether this is going anywhere or not, because I am 63 years old and not given to spending energy on things that aren't. I said, I think you should come down and see the place. She said, I think you should come up here first, because I'm not going anywhere until I know you're real. That stopped me short for about an hour. Then I thought, fair enough. I drove to Gillette in March, which was an act of either courage or lunacy depending on how the weather held. It mostly held. I got there in 4 days, staying at roadhouses 2 of the nights and once sleeping in the wagon under 3 blankets with the horses picketed close for warmth. I hadn't been nervous about a thing in 20 years. I was nervous driving into Gillette. Her place was about 4 miles out of town. I'd asked at the post office, and the postmaster gave me directions without blinking, which meant she was known there, which I took as a good sign. Small spread, neat. The house was better built than I expected for one person living alone. She'd added a lean-to on the east side that looked recent. 2 horses in a corral, good-looking animals. A kitchen garden, dormant under a thin snow but staked and ready for spring. Everything kept up, nothing hanging by a thread. She came out of the house when she heard the wagon. I had not let myself imagine too specifically what she'd look like. That way lies trouble. But I'll tell you what I saw. A tall woman, angular in the way of people who work outdoors, gray-haired, no nonsense about the way she stood. She had her arms crossed, not unfriendly, just considering. She looked at me the way you look at a horse you're thinking about buying, thorough, honest, not rushed. She said, you look older than I thought. I said, you look shorter. She said, I said tall, not that tall. And something in me, some held thing, some 4-year held breath, came loose. We stood there a moment. She had dark eyes and the squint of someone who'd spent a lot of years looking at horizons, and there was no pretense in her face at all. She said, well, come in then, coffee's on. Her kitchen was warm and smelled of pine and coffee and something baking. She'd made biscuits. Whether that was intentional or just her ordinary morning, I didn't ask and didn't need to. I sat at her table and she sat across from me and we talked for 6 hours. Not like strangers. That was the thing. The letters had done something, built a floor you could stand on, so that when you finally met in person you weren't starting from nothing. We talked about the letters some, and about the gaps between what you can put in writing and what you can't, and about how different the voice in your head is when you read a letter versus when you hear a person actually speak. Her voice was lower than I'd imagined it. She talked with her hands some, not a lot, just now and then when she was making a point. She asked me about Ruth, not in a jealous way, in the way of a woman who understood that a man's history was part of the man and she wanted the full accounting. I told her, more than I'd told anyone. She listened the way good listeners do, not waiting for her turn, actually listening, watching my face. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, She sounds like she was worth having." I said she was. Ellie said, "Good, that means you know the value of it." I didn't know what to do with that exactly, but I held on to it. I stayed 3 days. The second morning I went out early and looked at her fence line on the north pasture, which she'd told me in a letter was giving her trouble, posts heaved by the freeze. I spent the morning resetting 4 posts and restringing the wire, working in the cold with my breath making clouds, and when I came in for the midday meal, she looked at the work from the window for a long time without saying anything. She said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "Thank you, Cal." It was the first time she'd used my name and not just the pronoun, small thing. I noticed it. That afternoon she showed me her ledgers, which took some courage, I thought, showing a man you've only just met your accounts. They were careful and thorough, everything entered twice, a woman who knew exactly where she stood. She was not broke, but she was not easy either. The ranch ran on her own labor. She'd had a hired man for 2 summers, but couldn't afford him the 3rd year and hadn't replaced him. I looked at the ledgers, and I looked at her, and I thought, she has been carrying this alone for a long time. That night after supper, she made more coffee, and we sat by the stove, and she said, "I need to tell you something I didn't put in the letters." I said, "All right." She said, "I'm not easy to be around. I've been told that. I have opinions, and I say them, and I'm not going to stop. I've lived alone long enough that I have my ways, and they're set. I'm not looking for a man to manage me. I had a father who managed me for 12 years, and I was done with that the day he died. God rest him." I said, "I managed a ranch for 40 years. I don't have the energy left to manage a person." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Well, that's a reasonable answer." Third morning, coming time to leave, she walked out with me to the wagon. Cold, sky pale and flat. She watched me check the harness, and I could feel her watching, and I didn't mind it. I said, "I'd like to come back in May if that suits you." She said, "It suits me." I said, "And maybe you'd consider coming down in the fall, see the spread." She said, "Maybe." I picked up the reins, and she put her hand on the wagon side, not on my arm, not reaching for me, just on the wood, and she said, "Cal, I spent 30 letters getting nobody. I want you to know that finding yours felt like," she stopped, looked for the word, "like something shifting, something I'd stopped expecting." I didn't know what to say to that, either, but I looked at her hand on the wagon wood, and I said, "I know what you mean." She nodded once like we'd made an agreement, then she stepped back and I drove. I drove home in better weather than I'd come up in. The country opened out south of Gillette, big rolling grass and pale sky, and I sat on the wagon seat in my coat with the reins easy in my hands, and I felt, I want to say lighter, but that's not quite it. More like something had been set down. A weight I'd carried so long I'd stopped feeling it as separate from myself. She'd seen me, not the way Ruth had seen me. That was its own thing, and nothing would replace it, and I wasn't trying to. But Ellie had looked at me across her kitchen table, and she hadn't looked through me or past me or at the version of me she wanted to see. She'd looked at the actual man, 67, worn, not fancy, adequate at most things, and excellent at a few. And she'd thought, worth knowing. I don't know how to say how much that mattered without sounding like something I'm not, so I'll just say it mattered. A great deal. I went back in May. She'd planted the kitchen garden, and the place had that spring smell of turned earth and new growth, and she had a different energy to her, more color in her face, less contained. We worked her place for a week, fixed the lean-to roof that had started to go, moved her small herd to the better pasture now the grass was up. We ate supper together every night and talked until late, and neither of us ran out of things to say, which I took to be a good sign about the future. One evening she asked me what I thought about the letters now that I'd met her in person, whether she was what I'd expected. I thought about it. I said, "Better." She said, "Better how?" I said, "On paper you were someone I was interested in. In person you're someone I admire." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp was burning low and her face was half in shadow, and she had a coffee cup in both hands the way she did when she was thinking. She said, "That might be the best thing anyone's ever said to me, which is either a compliment to you or a poor reflection on the men I've known." I said, "Probably both." She laughed. She did laugh loud. She'd been right about that. I liked it. She came to Colorado in September. Drove herself, which I'd expected, though I'd offered to come get her. She rolled in on a Wednesday evening in a wagon she'd loaded with what she called her essentials, which was most of a household, practically speaking, blankets and tools and her good Dutch oven and 3 boxes of books she made no apology for. She looked at my house the same way she'd looked at me that first day in Gillette, thorough, honest, not rushed. She walked through the rooms, looked at the kitchen, ran a hand along the windowsill the way you do to test a thing. She went and stood in the doorway of the bedroom where Ruth and I had slept, and she didn't say anything for a moment, and I didn't either. Then she said, "It's a good house." I said Ruth picked the location, said the morning light would be better here than where I wanted to put it, and she was right. Ellie said she sounds like she knew what she was doing. I said she did. Ellie nodded, then she said, "Well, if it's all right with you, I'll put my books in the room at the end. I like having a place for books." I said, "That room's been empty 4 years. Put whatever you want in it." We were married in October at the courthouse in Benton, with the county judge and 2 witnesses who were strangers to us both and seemed mildly surprised to be present. Afterward, we ate at the one decent restaurant in town and drank 1 glass of whiskey each, which was more than either of us usually drank. She wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself, clean and plain, and she had her gray hair pinned up, and she looked, I want to say handsome, but that wasn't quite it either. She looked like herself, which by October was something I had come to value more than I could say. I gave her Ruth's wedding ring, which I'd been carrying in my coat pocket for 4 years, and asked her if she minded it. She held it for a moment, that little gold band, and she said, "I don't mind it. I'm glad you kept it." I said, "I want you to know something." She waited. I said, "I know how you've been treated. The letters, the men who didn't write back and the ones who came and left. I want you to know that is an accounting error on the world's part and not yours." She looked at me for a long time. Then she put the ring on and she put her hand over mine on the table and she said, "I think we wasted a lot of years, you and I." I said, "Maybe, but we've got some left." She said, "We've got some left." First winter together was the hard one. The way first winters always are, you find out about a person in winter. Cold pushes everything to the surface. But we were both old enough to know that hard wasn't the same as wrong, and we worked through the hard parts the way you work a seized hinge, patient and steady, and by spring the thing moved easy. She was right that she wasn't easy to live with. She had opinions and she said them, and half the time I thought she was wrong, and maybe a quarter of that half I told her so, and we argued in the way of people who take each other seriously enough to fight about things. That was new for me. Ruth and I had rarely argued. We just knew what each other thought. Arguing with Ellie was bracing, like cold water, made you feel alive. She learned my rhythms, and I learned hers, and we found the places where we fit, and the places where we didn't, and we negotiated the latter without too much bloodshed. She cooked better than me, which was not hard. I fixed things better than her, which also was not hard. She kept the books, which she was better at, and I was glad to be rid of. I handled the cattle end of things, which she helped with but didn't pretend was her strength. She talked at supper, every night. Things she'd been thinking about, things she'd read, questions about the world that didn't have answers but were worth asking anyway. I listened, and when I had something to say, I said it, and when I didn't, I just listened, and neither was wrong. By the second spring, I had stopped noticing the particular shape of the quiet. The house was not quiet anymore. Dix came up from New Mexico that summer with his wife and the 3 boys. I hadn't seen him in 4 years. He was polite to Ellie in the careful way of a grown son who doesn't know what to make of a development. And Ellie was polite back in the particular way she had of being polite, direct, and even and not performing anything. Second day of the visit, she took the oldest boy, who was 12 and going through that age where nothing interests you, and put him to work with her in the kitchen garden. I watched from the fence. She talked to him like a person, not a child, asked him questions like she expected real answers, and he gave them, and by the end of the morning he was asking her things. Dix watched this from the porch and didn't say anything. Third morning, Dix came and stood next to me at the corral fence. We'd been talking, just father and son talk, the kind that circles the real thing a few times, and he finally said, "She's good for you, Pop." I said, "I know it." He said, "I wasn't sure what to think when you wrote, 'A woman you'd never met found a letter.'" I said, "Neither was I." He said, "She's good." I said, "She is." We stood there a while watching the horses. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment briefly, the way men do, and then we talked about something else, but I held on to it. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. I was 67 when I found that letter. I'd done my life. That's what I thought I had done my life, the good parts of it anyway, and what was left was the maintenance of things, keeping what I'd built from falling down, waiting for the end without making too much fuss about it. I had counted myself out. Ellie Crane had been counted out by 30 men. 30. She'd sat in a small house in Wyoming and she'd written a letter to no one just to tell the truth of herself to the empty air because nobody else was listening. A man named Gus Albrecht had apparently been given the letter at some point, or stumbled across it somehow, and it had ended up in a box with some harness rings and a broken button hook. And then Gus had died and the box had sat in his barn, and then his wife sold everything and left, and the box sold for 60 cents because I wanted the plow behind it. You could call that luck, you could call it other things. What I call it is, a woman told the truth about herself, and it got to the man who needed to hear it, eventually, by a route neither of them would have chosen. And both of them had been so thoroughly told they were finished that they almost believed it. Almost. We've been together 9 years now, as I tell you this. We lost a good horse in the 3rd year, and Ellie cried for 2 days, and I let her. And she lost a quarter of her original stock in a hard freeze in the 5th year, and I helped her rebuild without a word about whether it was worth it, because it was. My right knee has gotten bad enough that the stairs are a project, and Ellie makes no comment about this, and neither do I. Her eyesight in the left eye has gone entirely, and she wears a pair of spectacles now that she initially refused to wear in public, and then wore anyway because she was Ellie, and she was done worrying about what people thought. She still talks at supper, I still listen. Sometimes I have things to say. Last fall we stood at the fence at evening, her shoulder against my arm, watching the light go off the grass, and she said, "You know what I thought that first day you drove up to my place?" I said, "What you think?" She said, "I thought, he's older than I expected, and then I thought, good, he'll understand some things." I said, "What things?" She said that you don't get this old without losing things, that a person who's lost things is a different kind of person than one who hasn't. She paused. I wanted someone who'd understand what things cost. I thought about that, I said, and... She looked up at me, one good eye, the light going amber around us both. She said, "And you did." She put her hand through my arm, the way she does. Her hand is dry and warm, and she has a grip on her that still surprises people who shake it. I put my hand over hers. The sun went down, the way it does out there, fast and complete, one color gone and then the whole sky changing at once. We stood there until the cold came up and then we went inside. That's what I wanted to tell you. That a letter nobody sent still got where it was going. That 2 people the world had finished with weren't finished with each other. That a good woman, if you're lucky enough to find her, or if she finds you, which is closer to how it happened, a good woman will see what you are. Not what you were, not what you used to be capable of, not the man in your best year. What you are right now, at the age you are, with all the miles on you. And if she sees that and stays anyway, that's not nothing. That's the whole thing.